In the good old days, long before the WWF became the WWE and Raw started giving marquee matches away on television for free, syndicated shows such as WWF Superstars and Wrestling Challenge, featuring the big name squashing anonymous wrestlers with questionable outfits and physiques, were all WWF fans got to see without driving to their local arena and buying a ticket. However, some of these so-called anonymous jobbers, as they were known in wrestling parlance, would go on to bigger and better things in the long run. Hello all, James here with ListMania Wrestling, and we think there's some names on this top 10 list that you may know, you probably will know if you're a hardcore wrestling fan, and a few that might just blow your mind. So here's our top 10 well-known future pro wrestling stars who appeared as fresh-faced, doe-eyed losers for hire on WWF Superstars and WWF Wrestling Challenge, specifically in the 1980s, in the episode order they appeared. Shane Douglas is a veteran of the squared circle for nearly 40 years and arguably one of the most underappreciated performers of all time. Before his career-making run as the franchise in ECW or his career-breaking run as Dean Douglas in the WWF, before being a dynamic dude in WCW or a manager in TNA, a young Troy Martin, who had been brought to the Providence Civic Center by his trainer Dominica DeNucci, shuffled to the ring to do battle with the then #1 contender to Hulk Hogan's WWF title, Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. Going under his real name, the future ECW champion would be put away by Paul Orndorff in under 2 minutes. Troy also appeared on the second episode of WWF Superstars, which was actually taped a day before the Wrestling Challenge taping, but would be shown a week later, with Mr. Martin once again taking the fall, this time to WWF Intercontinental Champion Macho Man Randy Savage. Shane would make 4 more appearances on WWF syndicated television in this time period under the new name of Mike Kelly, losing to King Harley Race, Butch Reed, Jake the Snake Roberts, and to the team of Don Morocco and Cowboy Bob Orton. A year and a few name changes later, Troy Orndorff, anybody? The newly christened Shane Douglas was picked up by Bill Watts UWF in mid-1987, shortly before the promotion went bust and sold to Jim Crockett Promotions. Shane actually would return to the WWF as a fresh-faced young rookie who was taken altogether more seriously than his initial appearance and looked to be heading into a spotlight role in the company after the WWF creative team actually wanted to repackage Shane as a Bon Jovi-style rock and roll singer. Instead, Douglas left the promotion after less than a year to head home to care for his ailing father, who was dying of emphysema. While Shane had mixed results in the WWF, he will always be remembered as the multi-time champion and top star for Paul Heyman's Extreme Championship Wrestling. And because we mentioned Dominica DeNucci in the previous entry, or because maybe you may well have read his first book, you'll be familiar with Mick Foley's first alter ego as Jack Foley, named after his father, facing off against the WWF Tag Team Champions at the time, the British Bulldogs. Wearing a sleeveless sheepskin number that looked inside out and raising his hand a la Baron von Raschke, the muscle-free Foley had dared to suggest prior to the bout that maybe he could do a spinning back elbow on one of the Bulldogs. Somewhere between amused and perturbed, the Bulldogs agreed. Come match time, Mick Foley squared off with the powerhouse of the Bulldogs, Davey Boy Smith. Davey Boy landed a running power slam and a stalling vertical suplex on Mrs. Foley's baby boy, but to Mick's credit, he actually kicked out of the subsequent pin attempt. But this was less to do with Mick's toughness, as it was due to Davey not establishing either of those moves as his finishing moves yet. Dynamite, who, to put it politely, was maybe a surly individual at the best of times, immediately showed his appreciation for Mick's prior elbow request by clotheslining Foley so hard in the jaw he legitimately had to ingest his next few weeks' meals through a straw. And before you ask, yes, of course, it was on purpose. Dynamite was so affronted that a young rookie dared to ask to perform one single maneuver on them that he decided to teach him a lesson by legitimately injuring him. That was how wrestling and locker room etiquette worked back in the 1980s. Foley and his far more experienced tag partner Les Thornton lost in 3 minutes 42 seconds. Mick would then return for more punishment, as was his MO in his future career, on the 3rd episode of Wrestling Challenge, then make a few more appearances over the next few months as Jack Foley, losing to Kamala and Hercules Hernandez, before a final appearance as Nick Foley, losing to Kamala one more time, this time in 27 seconds. Mick went on to make a name for himself in WCW and ECW in Japan before returning to the WWF in 1996, where he would immediately feud with The Undertaker, become a multi-time WWF World Champion, and create some memorable characters along the way. Yes, before he debuted as Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase's bodyguard in 1987, Virgil, as the stereotypically named Lucious Brown, made his WWF debut in tighty-whitey trunks to wrestle Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff again. Apparently, Virgil got into the business after a chance meeting with Tony Atlas in a gym, and you could clearly tell that Virgil had been hitting the gym hard, as he genuinely looked almost as impressive as Paul Orndorff did at the time. Lucious Brown only lasted one match in the WWF, going 2 minutes and 3 seconds before getting pinned via a patented Orndorff piledriver. Like so many other roided-up gym rats, Virgil quickly found a home in Memphis to hone his skills, which, quite frankly, he never really achieved, before re-entering the WWF with a new name, new character, and new spangly waistcoat and bow tie to act as DiBiase's dog's body. Renamed Virgil after breaking up with Ted DiBiase in the run-up to WrestleMania 7, he would then briefly become a mid-card single star before dropping down to essentially becoming what is known as a jobber to the stars, essentially an established name who would lose to other wrestlers. After being let go by the WWF in 1994, Virgil rattled around the indies for a couple of years before WCW renamed him Vincent and hired him to be the New World Order's bodyguard. Once again, it's just another way of saying he was going to be the one getting beaten up by the good guys, so the NWO stars didn't have to. Even though in later years Virgil became an online meme hawking his signed 8x10s wherever he could, Virgil enjoyed over a decade of being employed by major wrestling companies from that one WWF Superstars appearance all the way back in 1986. Okay, so we're kind of cheating with this one slightly with Bruiser Bedlam, but anyway, aka Johnny K9, he had actually debuted on WWF doing jobs in 1985 on the WWF's previously syndicated shows All-Star Wrestling and Championship Wrestling. Having said all that, the future Bruiser Bedlam was a mainstay jobber on WWF television from 85 to 88, losing every single one of his matches, naturally. Bruiser's only notable run within wrestling was during his time working in Jim Cornette's Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Aside from being managed by Cornette, Bedlam's greatest achievement was gaining a shock pinfall victory with many extracurricular shenanigans, by the way, over Macho Man Randy Savage. Savage graciously offered to lose because, hey, Savage wasn't hanging around the Smoky Mountain Wrestling and he thought it'd be nice to do Bruiser a favour. Outside of wrestling, Bruiser Bedlam's claims to fame are as numerous as they are astounding. Being true to the crew wasn't just a slogan tattooed onto his ever-displayed belly. Bruiser's rap sheet was as menacing as his appearance. Bedlam was part of a violent motorcycle gang, an enforcer and a debt collector. He had been in prison for extortion, assault, and forgery, and carrying a concealed weapon, and most famously, bombing Greater Sudbury Police Station in 1996, causing $133,000 in damage after initially threatening to bomb a strip club. An arrest for the murder of a criminal defense lawyer ended up seeing Bedlam remanded for 20 months before the case was discontinued. In his final years, Bruiser was finally locked up for transporting 418 kilograms of cocaine and further pled guilty along with several other co-conspirators to the murder of 2 people. Somehow, he convinced the parole board to let him free after serving only a few years before dying on February 21st, 2017. Yes, Steve "Motherfucking" Blackman was a WWF jobber at one time, although in fairness he had already actually completed a tour of New Japan Pro Wrestling, battling against some of that promotion's biggest stars before his WWF appearances. The future Lethal Weapon wrestled and defeated David Sammartino at a house show in Watertown, New York on March 9, 1988, before appearing on television alongside the jobber tandem of Outback Jack and the criminally underrated Brady Boone to take on Bobby Heenan's Islanders and a now heavily tattooed C.V. Affy. For someone with so little experience, it's not surprising that Blackman was pretty awful really in the broadcast match, but at least on television he looked even bigger than Haku, which apparently had not gone unnoticed by WWF officials. After a year-long run in the dying days of Stu Hart's Calgary-based Stampede territory, Blackman was invited back to the WWF for a tryout match at a house show in the Palace of Auburn Hills, where he defeated Iron Mike Sharp, as well as returning to Watertown to battle Boris Zukov. Steve's size and strength caught the eye of WWF officials once again, who were in the process of actually offering him a full-time contract to wrestle with the WWF. Then Blackman went on a fateful tour of South Africa, where he caught malaria and became so sick he ended up bedridden for 2 years. Another 4 years of strength and conditioning, supplemented with martial arts training of course, saw a leaner, more cut, but still scary strong Steve Blackman morph into the Lethal Weapon, and by 1997 Steve finally received his WWF contract and stayed with the promotion until he picked up an injury and retired from wrestling in the latter half of 2001. Now, once again, Louie Spicolli is another wrestler who started off doing jobs on WWF television, but unlike the others on this list, he continued doing squash matches for the company for like nearly 7 years before being given a break by Vince McMahon and co. A rare occurrence where most wrestlers were pigeonholed as enhancement talent would never become anything more. At just 17 years of age, the adolescent Spicolli took his first WWF loss courtesy of Outlaw Ron Bass, before being defeated by a cavalcade of wrestling heels such as Greg Valentine, Bad News Brown, One Man Gang, Big Boss Man and Harley Race, and that was just in 1988. Louie would go back and forth to various territories, with his first big success occurring in Mexico, called Madonna's Boyfriend in 1994. This led to his appearance on Mexican promotion AAA's only American pay-per-view offering at the time, When Worlds Collide, which led to his stock rising in the eyes of American promotions. Spicolli would return to the WWF in 1995 to portray the grunge music-inspired Rad Radford, but he'd lose almost as many matches playing the radical one as when he was professionally jobbing on television as Louie Spicolli. Louie would actually make a better go of it in ECW in 1996 and 1997, before jumping to WCW late in 97, where he would become a Chris Farley-like lackey to NWO founding member Scott Hall. Just as the character started catching fire, Louie Spicolli was found dead after choking to death on his own vomit after relapsing into soma addiction on February 15, 1998. Louie was very talented and remains one of the biggest what-if prospects of that era. Now here's another wrestler who actually started out in Japan as well as gaining a bit of experience in Memphis. Daryl Peterson wrestled under his real name for the WWF for a few matches in 1988 and 1989. Although, I'll tell you what, you'll be hard-pressed to actually find any damn footage of him, quite frankly. On my dodgy copy of WWF Superstars where he's meant to be wrestling Jim Duggan, that match is weirdly cut out entirely, and I don't even have the Wrestling Challenge videos from those years yet. And here's another thing, Hercules has actually been mislabeled as wrestling Daryl when it's actually DJ Peterson. But I did find an otherwise unlisted match of Bret Hart wrestling Daryl on an episode of WWF Primetime Wrestling from February 13, 1989. In the Bret Hart match, aside from losing a headlock early, Daryl really isn't actually that bad. There's some clunky spots and Daryl nearly tears both rotator cuffs by hanging onto the ropes while being knocked over them, but he really doesn't look as bad or as woeful as his hideous all-black singlet would signify. Daryl would then go on to complete more tours in Germany and Japan before landing in WCW in 1993 with his self-created heavy metal mosher persona of Max Payne, often teaming up with Cactus Jack before both left the promotion before the end of 1994. From there, Max Payne would jump back to the WWF under the moniker of The Blacksmith for one single match, before becoming the tie-dye bedecked resident guitarist of the WWF, Man Mountain Rock, where he, for whatever reason, was pitted against Mr. Bob Backlund for interminable months on end. A quick firing and a couple of final tent tours with Germany's Catch Wrestling Association, and Payne was done with wrestling entirely to work on his music, threatened to release a home video exposing the debauchery of the WWF wrestlers in 1995, and sue Rockstar Games over their unauthorized use of the name Max Payne with one X and not two for their computer game series, which was eventually settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. Yes, indeed, David Heath made a single appearance at the end of 1988, losing to the Big Boss Man in short order, and the almost angelic-looking Heath actually took a fairly impressive beating in his outing before succumbing to the Boss Man Slam. We all know Heath as the blood-spitting Lost Boy-esque Gangrel, but did you know that he actually carved out somewhat of a career for himself as a jobber in the mid-90s WWF as the Black Phantom? Between 1994 and 1995, Heath registered over 30 matches and over 30 losses to many of the biggest stars of the New Generation period. And as a final fun fact, Heath also made appearances for WCW and ECW as well, putting him in a select group that appeared for all three promotions. One of ECW's most recognised and decorated tag teams, the Pitbulls were once fresh-faced pups making a number of appearances on WWF syndicated television, starting off with the Hart Foundation in Binghamton, New York, and finishing up with a loss to the Fabulous Ones in Portland, Maine 6 months later, with some single matches thrown into the mix as well. The Pitbulls would actually go on to make one more WWF appearance in 1998, a year after their main run in ECW wrapped up, in a losing effort to the Headbangers in 6 minutes on a completely forgotten episode of WWF Shotgun Saturday Night. The Pitbulls will be forever linked with ECW as one of the Extreme Promotions' greatest tag teams of all time. As single stars, Shane Douglas and Gary Wolfe generated enormous sympathy and acrimony in equal measure from the ECW faithful after a DDT went wrong and Pitbull number 1 Gary Wolfe's neck was broken. Months of promos and a hairy situation where Douglas jerked around Gary Wolfe's halo to keep his surgically repaired neck in place resulted in a near riot at the ECW arena, culminating in a match with Shane defeating Pitbull number 2 at ECW's first ever pay-per-view, Barely Legal. Our final entry on this list, and for us maybe the biggest surprise, was Jerry Lynn's brief career as a WWF jobber. Even more surprising is Lynn's age here. We presumed he was about 18 or 19 with his little wispy mustache and total lack of charisma, coupled with his ubiquitous white jobber knee pads. But in fact, he was a couple of months shy of his 26th birthday, proving that we all develop physically at different rates. A couple of matches at the same Wrestling Challenge taping against Rick Martel and the team of the Twin Towers yielded a grand total of 5 minutes and 9 seconds of ring time, and Lynn's career wouldn't really get any better in the short term, jumping to the AWA in 1989 shortly before they collapsed, then arriving in USWA in 1991 before starting a reputation for himself as somewhat of an underground hit in Global later that same year. Jerry would do some more enhancement work for the WWF in 1995, then he'd get hired by WCW and put under a mask as the mysteriously named Mr. JL. Jerry would briefly return to the WWF for a couple more bouts in 1997, before achieving his greatest success in ECW, most notable for his numerous bouts with Rob Van Dam. One final attempt to make it in the WWF in 2001 yielded no favourable results, but more memorable runs in TNA and Ring of Honor, and essentially every promotion except the WWE has made sure that the super talented and underappreciated Mr. Lynn is not only fondly remembered for his in-ring work, but remains employed in the wrestling business, currently as a producer for Tony Khan's AEW. And there you have it, 10 famous names that did jobs on WWF Superstars and Wrestling Challenge in the 1980s. But before we go, here's a few more interesting names that we came across during our research. Curtis Thompson, who would go on to become Firebreaker Chip in WCW during the Jim Herd era. He would reach his greatest fame as one half of a backstage fight with Diamond Dallas Page. John White, aka Johnny Hotbody, one of ECW's original stars when the E still stood for Eastern. Chuck Williams, aka Rockin' Rebel, one of the biggest pieces of shit in the history of the wrestling business, a talentless goof that very few people liked, a lifelong domestic abuser that culminated in him shooting his wife dead before killing himself. Shame he didn't do it the other way round. He mercifully died on June 1st, 2018. Paul Van Dale, now a jobber of such little repute nobody actually remembers him, but wrestling fans will remember his daughter, former WWE Women's Champion Carmella. Jeff Gaylord, don't laugh. Another of those wrestling oddballs that did the job on WWF syndication early in his career before making a meager living in the Little Leagues. He briefly played one of Shawn Michaels' Knights at the Survivor Series 1993 pay-per-view, and then he robbed a bunch of banks and then did significant jail time as a result. He died March 15th, 2023. Brick Bronski basically did a couple of years in Calgary in the late 1980s. He was a bodybuilder and champion powerlifter. He would go on to even greater depths of semi-anonymity by starring in a bunch of F-grade action films for Troma Entertainment in the 1990s. He also stands out as a man who quite clearly wrote his own Wikipedia page. He died on August 23rd, 2021. Sonny Beach, another lower-level name who had a decent run in All Japan, and also featured on Herb Abrams' UWF's only televised supercard, UWF Blackjack Brawl. That's the event that drew 600 people to the MGM Grand Garden Arena in 1994. And there you go, 10 prominent wrestling names that got their starts, or at least near enough, as WWF jobbers in the 1980s. Please give us a like if you like this video, if you don't like it anyway. If you didn't, then keep it to yourself, Negative Nancy, and also let us know which of these future wrestling stars you were surprised to see on this list. We'll be bringing out at least one 1990s version, probably two in the future, so stay tuned, subscribe, and we'll catch you for the next video.